Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Six Foe, the dedicated Nintendo 64 podcast never been done before. Now, you already know I'm lying. There's been a couple Nintendo 64 podcasts out there. But what makes us different is we keep the vibes rolling like it's 1996, even though we've never lived a day in my life in 1996. So make sure you take a second to get ready, because we're about to get in and get out. Once again, hello everybody. This is The Six Foe, the Nintendo 64 podcast, never been done before, quote unquote. I'm your host, Josiah Scott. I'm also going to be joined by an interchange host named Kareem Shaw. I say interchange because he's not going to be here 100% of the time, which is okay. But to get you guys started, this podcast is called The Six Foe because we're going to be talking all about the Nintendo 64 and everything around it. And let me tell you like this right now, there's so much more to the system than what you guys probably already know. Or do you? Well, I want you to ask you real fast, how much do you know about the system? Do you know from every game A to Z, from Mario 64 all the way to Tony Hawk Pro Skater, the final one on the installment on the system? Or are you just a complete novice, not knowing what the system is? Now, I'm going to be real with you guys here. And I find this so funny. If you do know this system, it's either you are a straight millennial or you're one of those people of Gen Z. Or you're a boomer who had kids. Point blank and simple. But to make it fun, think about a time where you might have heard about it. You might have known about it. You might have even played it. And you never even realized it. The Nintendo 64 is, without a doubt, one of the most revolutionary video game systems of all time, as it put the standard to 3D gaming in a whole new level that you never would have thought it would have reached in its time of era. For example, in 1996, a lot of 3D games took shape after when the Nintendo 64 first released. And that's because its mark left such a big impact that the Nintendo 64's games library is a huge blueprint to a lot of successful 3D games that you know now. God of War series, Witcher, you got some Minecraft elements that are taken from first persons from the Nintendo 64. Just a whole plethora of 3D gaming was accessed and revolutionized through the Nintendo 64. Before we go into the system, I want to talk a little bit about myself, and I'm not trying to be narcissistic. I'm just going to tell you the story of how I love this system. I was born in 2001, but my story actually begins in 1999, where my mom won a Nintendo 64 at a work event. Now, I did have a brother that grew up in 96, and he was the one that played it first. So he played it, when I was growing up, baby ages. I started playing it, probably was mashing the heck out of my controller, but it was my very first video game system. I call myself a little bit of an old head because that was my first video game system compared to the peers around me that grew up in the same era as me. I was Nintendo 64, yet they were like the late end of GameCube and Wii. And I find that very interesting because there's just like gap between the years of what you explore. There's very few of people who grew up like in the 2000s on a Nintendo 64 compared to everybody else, which is okay. Mostly everybody grew up in the 2000s with either a PS2 or a Wii or Xbox 360 in the later half. I'll say that the Xbox 360 was more of a 2010s thing. Maybe early 2010s because that's when Call of Duty was rocking the block, but we're going to go back another 10 years right there. But yeah, that's like the whole thing about it is like in that era, I just was like, I felt like a oddball because I had such an older system compared to everybody else's. And there's so many people you would not believe do not know the Nintendo 64 exists. Like I said it all this time. Like if you know it exists, you're either a millennial, a boomer that had kids, or you're one of those people of Gen Z who cares and is curious about older media. And that's okay to be it. Honestly, I would love to educate people on Nintendo 64 and how it built the blocks of 3D gaming to what it is now. One thing to make clear is that the Nintendo 64 wasn't the first 3D system. It just revolutionized how we played it. And that is a big way to understand how the system puts itself in the gaming hemisphere. My first memory was playing Super Mario 64. That was my first ever game. And I tell you, I did jack. I literally just ran around. I was jumping, accidentally killing myself in water, drowning myself, deleting my brother's save profile, making him angry, doing it again, doing it all over again with a huge smile on my face. Then I started to realize the concept of what I was playing. I was like, oh, actually, I there's an objective in this game. You know what I mean? I was like, well, really what helped me build consciousness. But yeah, Super Mario 64 being the first game I ever played and still holds near and dear to my heart to this day. To this day. Now, how does this affect me now? A lot of the games that I play now are kind of derived from this era of the game. For example, play heavy Smash Bros. A lot of the games I can play like multiplayer from like Ocarina of Time. It really teaches you how to like enjoy games for what it is. In this era of games where it's like it feels like so mysterious but yet so like adventurous. And you know, in an era where a bunch of video games had a lot of identity, and that's what I loved about the Nintendo 64. Each game has its own identity. It really does. So I love that. I love that about the system. I love the colors of the system the most too. The green, the blue, the yellow, and the red. They seem super standard colors, but when you see it on the logo, they just pop in a way that I've never seen them before. You know, you got predominantly the green and the blue and the yellow and the red are the complementary, making that logo really iconic. To sum it all off, you know, the Nintendo 64 has just been that kind of system that I always find myself going back. And as a 24-year-old, I've decided to make it a goal alongside I would make it like a small long-term goal to just collect every Nintendo 64 game ever imagined, ever released. And I think that would be a really nice milestone. Everyone's got their collector milestones, and that's going to be mine. So that's my story with the Nintendo 64. And I'll tell you what, I am so thankful that I get to be on here and just talk about it. And that's the cool thing about it is I'll be able to talk to you guys. And don't worry, I might not be just, you know, talking into a mic, but once this message gets relayed, I'm definitely open to having conversations with anybody about the N64. I could talk for ages about it. It's just a system I can just nerd out with. To give you guys a brief summary of this show, what we're going to do, and what you're going to see down the line. What we like to do here on the show, so next week, we're going to talk about each and individual game in depth. Maybe some facts that you haven't uncovered yet. Talk about the game's base. Talk about who it appealed to. Talk about who it was made for. Talk about its purpose on the system and in the gaming world from a broader view. And also, we're going to talk about some other things around the N64. Like, for example, additions, rumors. That's a very popular one. Rumors are very popular with the N64. And also, you know, rumble packs, features, all that good stuff. So this is going to be like the introductory episode. Next week, we talk about each game, starting with Super Mario 64, which I cannot wait to talk about that one. Hopefully my host or interchangeable host who will be there. I call him the interchangeable host because he's not going to be there 100% of the time, and that's going to be okay. You know, he's got his own life. But when he puts that time aside to talk here on this show with us, his name is Kareem Shah, a.k.a. K-Do Commando. Shout out my boy. The structure of the show will be to make sure that people who don't know what games we're talking about get informed, and the people who do know about the games we're talking about just indulge in nostalgia. Because at the end of the day, you know, it's all good vibes right here. That's all we want to have. And I don't think anybody gets a super bad vibe unless you're talking about a super bad game. You know, A game is interesting because it's how people perceive it differently and how they're able to go about completing it. And I want to share those kinds of memories with those who enjoy the Nintendo 64 like I did. And especially in the era where the internet wasn't a super big thing and you couldn't just look up how to do everything. Just kind of going through each other's thought process of, okay, how did you complete this? How did you complete that? How did you complete the water temple? Because I'm going to tell you this right now, I completed the water temple in a really, really messed up way. I know to sound base, but, just to give you that idea of what we're looking at. Every 10th episode will be a special episode. So it's not just going to be just constant games. We'll probably do some like trivia. We might do like, a special guest, which I'm looking for very soon. We'll do some roulettes just to keep you guys on your toes. We might even do it every 5th episode just to keep the fun going. You know what I mean? I project this to do every Nintendo 64 game. So that's about 300 episodes right there. So this is going to be the starter. Maybe in the middle, we'll do a marker. And I hope to complete the journey. And one thing is that this show is about a journey. You know what I mean? And part of the journey is the end. And part of the journey is also the beginning. And I'm looking to do both. And the coolest part is because, if you want to keep a journey going, but you don't know what the heck you're looking for, you're going to get lost. There is no getting lost here. We're going to go from goal 1 all the way to goal 300. And I plan on getting there with you guys in the most smilest way possible. Before we move on, we're going to take a brief break here in the broadcast. But don't go far. Take this time to zone out and tune in as you listen to this hot new track, Kuma Zone by Aqua Sky. You are listening to JSA Network. This is the Sixpo. And welcome back, everybody, to the Sixfold, the dedicated Nintendo 64 podcast. Never been done before. I'm Josiah Scott here once again. Gonna just bring you guys back in, give you a little introduction of what we were looking at. So now I'm gonna give you guys an introduction to the system. For those who know, this is just a callback of how the system came to be, and for those who don't, feel free to get informed because the Nintendo 64 had an interesting launch that needs to be captivated before we begin. Okay, take you back to 1995, maybe even a little before, maybe just a little bit after. But in this era, this is where Nintendo was really rocking the block. However, they were looking to continue and push the agenda of what they were previously going for. As all the other game companies were moving towards CDs in this way that you can have more storage and more accessibility on the CDs rather than regular cartridges that Nintendo had implemented. As Nintendo had tried their hand at the CDs, they opted to try going back to the cartridges. In this era, this is where Sega and Nintendo were trying to work together to try and find some sort of system. As Nintendo and Sega brought their ideas together of what could have been a prototype combined system of, like, for example, like the Nintendo 64, Sega Saturn, or something like that, Nintendo dropped out. And they rethought their decision of working, and they were like, no, we don't want to work with a bunch of third parties. Sega was furious about this. And so what did they do? They took every opportunity to blast Nintendo. The Nintendo vs. Sega beef was one for the ages, and I just wished I was alive to see it. I was alive to see Kendrick versus Drake. I really wish I was alive to see Nintendo versus Sega. And if there was going to be one person that'd bring it back, I hope to be that one person. Because man, oh man, were these ads entertaining. There were so many ads of the Sega Genesis absolutely tearing the SNES apart, and SNES apart taking action against the Sega Genesis. They were at each other's throats. And it's no wonder as to why people pit Mario and Sonic together. The rivalry between companies was something else. And for a time, the Sega Genesis even overtook the SNES. In this stage of where gaming started to become a really volatile state, Nintendo was looking to try and release a 3D system in the time span, but however, they were under a really big crunch and suffered some delays. In this time, they switched back to cartridges. A big reason why they did was to prevent the piracy and to stop people from taking games from their systems and put it on CDs so they wouldn't have to pay for them. One big downside to the cartridges, however, was the storage and the power that was displayed. Like I said before, CDs, you could play very powerful and have much more storage on games, whereas a cartridge has very limited storage compared to its competitors. As Nintendo geared up for the release of what was called the Ultra 64, there was a lot of problems going into the release. For example, they didn't really have a lot of good release titles that were gearing up, and they had a whole new system ready to go called the Ultra 64, not really given the hype around it. In this era, a lot of the game systems were just going for the whole, let's put the name brand on the system. For example, the PlayStation, who had 2 years above the Nintendo 64, sold quite a bit, as if the PlayStation really made a name for itself under Sony's arms. Alongside that, the Sega Genesis was starting to bark its way back up into the gaming world and be a meta presence with games like the Sonic. They had other fighting games where Virtual Fighters came through. We had Street Fighter, very iconic, heavy games that came on the Sega Genesis that released with power. So you had to ask, how was Nintendo going to top that? Well, they did a little bit of a change. They swapped to the Nintendo 64. That was the name. The Nintendo 64 was the final name for the system. And it had a very successful launch, or somewhat. I say somewhat because it did really well with limited resources. So how can we see this? Let's go into the facts. Hit the facts button for me. The Nintendo 64 launched with 3 games. 3 games. Now, in Europe and some of the other regions, they did launch with other games too. But the Europe launch was a whole year after the American and the Japanese launch. And those three games were Super Mario 64, Pilot Wing 64, and the Japanese exclusive Sakio Haibu Shogi in North America. And it did really well with just 3 launch titles. Usually, a system has about 5 to 6 launch titles, maybe even 7. The PS2 had about 7 to 8 launch titles, which you can rotate around and still not get bored, as there was a lot to play on those systems. So the Nintendo 64 had 3 launch titles, yet they did so well. But one stood head and shoulders above the rest, and that was Super Mario 64, because that was a game that you had gotten with the system. And a lot of kids who were able to get their hands on the N64 at that time, their first introduction to 3D gaming was Super Mario 64, as it was able to revolutionize the gaming state in a way that it was just a huge jump. Something that was so revolutionary you couldn't believe it was real. But with this being said, one big problem, like we said before, be only having those little bit of launch titles, there wasn't really a lot of life to the system at the time. It was just really Super Mario 64. Pilot Wings was there because you had the system as well. Because it was an exclusive in Japan, Sakio Haibo Shogi definitely was limited to a very certain audience. So in this sense, how did the Nintendo 64 just do so well? I mean, here's the crazy part. It didn't do as well as you thought it did. It's popular and revolutionary as what you would thought it'd be for like a system that sold like 100 million. That was actually the original PlayStation. The original PlayStation, yet granted it had 2 years old on the Nintendo 64, outsold the Nintendo 64 like 100 million to like 30 million. So in this sense, it looks like the Nintendo 64 was a commercial failure, but not as much as you think it was. Like we said, it was limited by its own power and Nintendo's own sought ability. And when I say sought ability, I mean the fact that they refused to have as much third-party service as you would want it to be. Now, just imagine if there was that third-party support the Nintendo 64 had compared to all the others. At the time that the system had launched, it was beating, the Sega Genesis, and it was also beating the PlayStation with no to little third-party support. And that's something to behold. That's not easy to do. Yes, Super Mario 64 was pioneering the way, but that just goes to show what quality of the games that were so much different from in this era of the gaming sphere. As gaming was more underground and seen for children, the way that it was, brought about, you gotta wonder just how like the selection was so different, or maybe how scarce those games were back then, because there was quite a huge selection of PlayStation 1 games. Some iconic titles even dropped at that point. But to have Nintendo 64 games, it was really, really slim. To give you a rough idea of what the Nintendo 64 accomplished was just to implement itself in the 3D hemisphere. Like we said before, it was a blueprint. It was a blueprint to a lot of 3D games and made itself available to be that blueprint. And a lot of people have taken ideas and success from Nintendo 64 games. One big one is first-person shooters with GoldenEye 007 being the way that you handle yourself in the game, the way you're able to have combat. You see those in a lot of first-person shooters, which is a very popular genre in gaming as a whole, as that genre continues to evolve as well. One thing that I want to talk about the Nintendo 64 is actually how the system is designed and the controller. The N64 has a regular base setup with 4 controller ports and a cartridge in the middle. It's got an off button. It's got a reset button. It's got its regular cord plug-ups. And it is looking to be a very standard system, honestly. But then you look at the controller. When I think of the Nintendo 64, I think of the controller before I think of how the actual system looks. And the reason why is because the controller is such a unique design. It has not been replicated to this day. It is a 3-sided controller with a joystick in the middle. It's got 2 buttons, A, B. It's got 4 C buttons in all different directions. And on the left-hand side, it's got a D-pad. It's got 2 shoulder buttons. and a Z button hidden away on the back of the controller that not a lot of people know it's there. What I find so interesting about the N64 controller is that you always know you're holding the controller. A PS1, Xbox, PlayStation 2, all those controllers, those are great controllers, but you just kind of forget it's there. The N64 controller, you always know it's in your hands. And the reason why is because its feel is just so unique and different from everybody else's. It's like, what were they thinking with this? But then it's like you play the games and you understand. It's like, oh, it's not just a 3D system. It has the capability of taking 2D farther than you ever thought. And those 2D games being some of the fighting games, and I say some of the fighting games, for example, like the Mortal Kombat trilogy. You could even go for Deadly Arts, aka Gas Fighters, but it has its spear where it goes and changes from 2D to 3D as well. And some of the Flying Dragon is a perfect example of that. And you have some other games where it just specializes in 3D, like for example Banjo-Kazooie and Donkey Kong 64, where they're really good with the camera angles at the time. Highlight _ at the time. I already know those camera angles are abysmal for now, but at the time, yeah, everybody thought they were playing a movie. But yes, the controller of the Nintendo 64 is something that is just really iconic with the system. Like I said, I feel like the controller is more iconic looking than the actual system itself. And that's hard to say because, everybody gets their looks through the system, how it is designed. And the controller is just meant there to wave the wand of the magician that has it. I find it so interesting because, the games that were on the N64 utilized each of the button layouts differently on the N64. And you didn't really know what you were going to get. So you had to really make sure you knew the game so you can get in touch with the controller. There's so many times where I give somebody or have somebody play the Nintendo 64 for the very first time and they are just confused. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to get their hands positioned correctly. They fumble it around, man. They break it like Russell Westbrook. But at the end of the day, it's just like so unnatural for people to just grasp onto this controller and just be like, oh, wow. Like, you really have to know and you really have to feel it in your hands. It's not something you can just, pick up and be like, oh, I'm playing. It feels weird to people who have never played it before. But yet to me, it feels so natural because I just understand. And to those who are able to just pick up an N64 controller and go right ahead, you're a special breed of person and I love you. So fist up in the air for me real fast. With the controller, I do also want to point out that there was a lot of phases of the controller it went through, as it has accessories and also it has different forms of production, as there was multiple colors of it. Looked really cool, colors that mirrored the system, some pretty rare colors, and it had even a see-through phase, which I have adored, as I've recently purchased a couple see-through controllers because that see-through aesthetic of the Y2K era is just something to behold, and I love it greatly. Last thing before we wrap this up, I wanted to talk about the style of games. Now, I am a sucker for low-res poly games. In the era where 3D was deemed HD, and now you look back on it, and it's like polygon aesthetic, it looks really, really cool. There are some games that aged like milk, and there are some games that aged like fine wine. And let me tell you, there's quite a bit of games that you would not expect that aged pretty well in an N64 that do its justice pretty well. I think what makes it super cool is because the N64 has this kind of style of games where it's like bright and colorful and there's so many things to do. But in some ways, when it got creepy unexpectedly. And that's where the liminality of the N64 kind of comes into place. A lot of it is famously known for like the Super Mario 64 liminality. You got some instances like in the horror of the games, it gets really spooky and atmospheric, which is something that I'm a big fan of. Is that taking low res poly resolutions and making it revolutionary for the gameplay. That's something I will always adore. Okay. So to those who have now just got an introduction to the N64, I want to ask, how do you feel? Is it interesting? Will it make you pick up the game system? Will you go to your nearest nerd friend and be like, "Hey, you have this?" and see if they're how bright their eyes just light up? Because you don't just go over your friend's house for the N64. You got to know it's there. You got to know it's there. And you know we're here. And we're going to be here for a long, long time. Thank you guys so much for tuning in for this first episode of The Sixth Foe. I plan to have my co-host here more time so you guys can get his input, his ideology, because he is probably just as big of a N64 fan as I am, and can't wait to make the magic happen. So without further ado, I'm Josiah Scott, signing off for now. But hey, have a fantastic Friday, and I'll see you next time.